Hey guys, welcome in. This is Sports and Money Pro Football GM. This is your Steelers segment with me. I'm Simon Shortt. Thank you so much for checking this out. Please make sure you guys like and subscribe to the channel, as well as follow me along on these videos while I take you through the Pittsburgh Steelers' latest and biggest news of the offseason. And then we get more into the later parts of the offseason. I'll have some fun content for you as we get ready for training camp. So be sure to follow along and check us out here at Sports and Money Pro Football GM. You can also head over to Apple or Spotify for my podcast, the Simon Shortt Podcast, where I will be switching gears a little bit this summer, but you can come there for more of a long form version of videos like this and more sports content. So thank you so much again for being here. Today is Sunday, April 24th. What I am here to talk to you about today is the Pittsburgh Steelers re-signed safety Terrell Edmunds just a couple days ago. And that's a move that's very, very important for a number of reasons. But number one, it plugs the final hole in the team's roster ahead of Thursday's NFL draft. So we're now just 5 days away from the draft, and the Steelers had a major, major hole at strong safety. And that's not good. The Steelers don't like to do that. The Steelers like to go into drafts with every starting spot and really some depth pieces as well kind of filled and taken care of. That way they can truly just take the best player they believe is available on the board on their list, and they don't have to worry about fit or, oh, we have to fill this roster spot because we're bad here. They just want to take what they believe is best player available, even though I'm sure there's some positional need and value taken into account. We'll go through each of those kind of examples here in just a couple minutes, but first just want to focus on Terrell Edmunds for a minute. You guys can actually go on to phantomsportsofficial.com and check out a couple pieces that I had about the very subject ahead of time. So this I did January 13, 2022. So during the season, talking about this, why the Steelers should re-sign Terrell Edmunds. And a lot of the pros that I listed out in this article are the same ones I'm going to discuss right now. So I'm giving you a little sneak peek, but definitely be sure to go back and check out this article for a little more detail. But number one, he was cheap, and he was a lot cheaper than I think any of us really expected he would be. The Steelers don't normally do these 1-year contracts unless they're getting the very bare minimum veteran benefit contract. But they got him for cheap, 1 year, $2.5 million. So they can still clearly do whatever they want when it comes to the draft and know they only have 1 year really sunk into Edmunds. If they still wanted to go safety in round one or even round two, it would not be this contract does not stop them from doing that based on a financial investment. Two, chemistry. Other than the offensive line, the defensive backfield is the position group that most requires strong chemistry on the football field, especially the way the Pittsburgh Steelers want to play and I think are moving towards playing this upcoming season with Terrell Austin becoming the defensive coordinator. They're going to do a lot more disguises, a lot more interesting things in the defensive backfield, probably playing more of a zone defense than they have in years past. And having another person back there that has been on the team for a few years, especially the guy that plays next to Minka, who you want to be able to roam around and use his instincts and his athleticism to make plays. You want a guy next to him that really knows him. Having Terrell Edmunds be that guy, even though he himself in a vacuum maybe isn't the best safety in the world, especially from a coverage standpoint, him having that chemistry with the rest of the guys, whether it's Minka Fitzpatrick, Cam Sutton, he knows them, they know him. They can lean on each other and help each other out. So that's going to be really, really important, as opposed to having a rookie come in day one who is not only going to be brand new to the team, but brand new to the NFL as well. That's a tough transition to make when you have a defense that's supposed to be top 5, top 3 in the league. So the next article you can check out on phantomsportsofficial.com is who will play safety for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Through here, I kind of outlined a couple options Pittsburgh still had as of April 10th, 2022. So just a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks to the day, actually. And this was kind of coming off of an interview Kevin Colbert did, stating that they believe they have 24 out of 25 starting positions kind of locked down. So they knew strong safety was the only position they had left. You knew they wanted to do something about that in free agency. Terrell Edmunds was obviously a very high priority type of choice for them. Tyrann Mathieu, the Honey Badger, was someone that fans really, really wanted to get into, which obviously would have been a lot of fun for his versatility. Some sneaky other names I had mentioned. Landon Collins was a guy I was really, really interested in because of his background as more in the box safety, a hard hitter, even played linebacker this past year for the Washington Commanders. I threw out some other veteran free agents that were out there and talked about some of the internal options that the team still has on the roster. So definitely check those out to maybe just see who else is kind of around that Pittsburgh could look into, because again, they don't have a huge financial investment made into Terrell Edmunds at this time. So again, when it comes to the Steelers and wanting to plug every single hole that they have on the roster before the draft, that's something that has been proven through history. When you look at their first or even second round picks, they're clearly not making those with the idea that that player has to be a starter, or they go into the draft saying we have to draft X position here. It's way more about the player. So we're going to go through a couple examples, even just of the recent few years, but you can do this if you just pull up Pro Football Reference and you go through the draft list, and then you match it to the roster that the Steelers already had before that rookie came in. You'll see that there were options. Now, is it very easy to see where the rookie was clearly an upgrade? Absolutely. In 2017, TJ Watt was the team's first round pick, and the veterans that were on the roster were Arthur Moats and James Harrison. James Harrison, we're talking year 15, year 16 that year. Obviously, he was ready to be done. He left the team shortly after. Arthur Moats as well, a career, go Dukes, a career rotational guy, a career, backup, a solid, serviceable veteran. But clearly, TJ walked in as the best guy in that room. So I'm not saying that the Steelers always have guys that are better than rookies. That's definitely not the case, but they always have guys that are comfortable starting and playing significant snaps until that rookie is truly ready to be a starter. So let's take a look at some of these other seasons here, and we will try to compare what the Steelers have going this year to some of those times. So again, here, just hop on Pro Football Reference. You can see all of this stuff really easily. So even just last year, we'll start with they took a running back, a tight end, a center, an offensive tackle, a linebacker, a defensive end, an outside linebacker slash edge rusher defensive end, a defensive back, and a punter in last year's draft. Obviously, turned out to be a pretty good draft when you take a look at it as a whole. Oh man, we're bouncing around here. So obviously a pretty good draft, but they were prepared going into the draft to have all those needs met. Now you could argue, and I would argue, that running back wasn't really a strong position. But at that time, James Conner had left. They really only had Benny Snell on the roster as a true runner, but that's a guy they just took a couple years ago and spent a mid-round pick on. So in theory, maybe they were okay with playing Benny Snell. If not, there's always veteran running backs or even young undrafted running backs. So in theory, it's easy to put that position together, but everyone knew that this team had eyes on Najee Harris going into the draft. What their backup plan was, I don't know, because they didn't have a great one on the roster, but perhaps to them, Benny Snell would have been just fine. Then you look at the tight end position. They had Eric Ebron, Zach Gentry, and Kevin Rader all on the roster. All of those guys have clearly spent time on the 53-man roster for the Steelers in the last couple of years. And Eric Ebron was a guy that they just went out and signed as an external free agent, and he came off of a really strong first year with Pittsburgh. So even if they didn't go tight end early in the draft or get a strong one at some other point, they very clearly had a starter in place in Eric Ebron. Now, was a good thing Pat Freiermuth ended up getting drafted, of course, because Ebron had an up and down year and then had an injury in the late part of the year. But you could argue that Ebron could have replicated his first year in Pittsburgh's numbers if Freiermuth had not been drafted. So there was still a pretty good internal option. Then you take a look at center Kendrick Green. Obviously, I think if you could pick one position to maybe do over from last year's draft, it would be this one. But the team still addressed the position in free agency beforehand. They had re-signed offensive lineman B.J. Finney, who was on the team for his rookie contract, and then got a big deal with Seattle, and then fell out of favor there and was traded to the Bengals. And they brought him back as a free agent. That's the kind of move the Steelers like to make, where it's a stopgap, cheap option, a guy they have familiarity with, and a guy they know, hey, if we have to start this guy at center, we'll be happy with it. Now, again, was that necessarily the right move? Was he maybe the best person to have in there? No. But that was the idea, and it was very clear thinking. When Marquise Pouncey retired and they needed to have a center on the roster, go out and get a guy who played decently well for you, spent a few years with you, and is pretty good at center. Now, again, he was better at guard, and he didn't really get any snaps at center. They had also re-signed J.C. Hassenhauer prior to this season. So between those two guys, that they at least knew, okay, with these two guys here, we have someone if we don't get a center we like in the draft. In the fourth round, they took offensive tackle Dan Moore Jr. And prior to that, they had re-signed Zach Banner to a 2-year contract. And they went out externally as well and signed Joe Haig from Kansas City Chiefs. So they made 2 moves at tackle before drafting Dan Moore Jr. And clearly the idea was for Dan Moore to be the 4th tackle to start the year and not even dress on game day. And due to injuries, that very clearly went a different direction. Buddy Johnson, the inside linebacker, they had brought in Robert Spillane, or re-signed Robert Spillane and Marcus Allen to that point before drafting him. Isaiah Loudermilk, they drafted in the 5th round, and they had re-signed Chris Wormley to that point. So they very clearly were set at defensive end at that point. They brought in Quincy Roche. That was their 6th round pick, even though they had re-signed Cassius Marsh before the draft. Trey Norwood, a versatile defensive back. They had made some moves in the defensive backfield. Obviously, re-signed Cam Sutton. They brought in special teamer and safety Miles Killebrew. So they had made some moves there in the defensive backfield. And then they drafted a punter, the only punter drafted last year, Presley Harvin III. But before that, they re-signed Jordan Berry, a punter who had been on the roster and punted for them for a few years. So clearly they felt okay about punter. And if you're going to draft a punter, you feel really good about them. And yet they still signed somebody, and he competed during the offseason with Harvin. So they had a position battle already. They had a plan in place in case they didn't get the guy they wanted in Harvin in the draft. Let's go back a little bit further, 2020. So they draft a wide receiver, an edge rusher, a running back, an interior offensive lineman, a defensive back, and a defensive lineman. So in the 2020 free agency, it was either re-signed or acquired Bud Dupree, so that Alex Highsmith didn't need to start right away. His rookie year, he was the 3rd edge rusher for most of the year until Dupree's injury. They also re-signed Matt Filer, who ended up playing guard for them, but guard tackle. They also brought in external free agent Stefan Wisniewski, who was an interior offensive lineman. So they brought in 2 guys ostensibly who played guard and could have played guard ahead of Kevin Dotson. And both those guys did do that until injuries hit. And Dotson still rotated in, ended up starting a couple games toward the end of the year. But they brought those guys in before drafting Dotson. That was also the first year they had acquired Chris Wormley. They had traded for him in that offseason. So they had someone in place on the defensive line before Carlos Davis. They also re-signed Tyson Alualu in that offseason. So they had someone there as well. Antoine Brooks Jr., who was kind of a safety nickel corner hybrid that was on the team that year as a rookie. They had Jordan Dangerfield already re-signed, so they had some depth there already. And then in terms of those skill positions, Chase Claypool and Anthony McFarland, they obviously already had depth at wide receiver. They had Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, and James Washington to that point. And in the running back room, before they added Anthony McFarland, they had James Conner, Benny Snell, and Jalen Samuels. Now, again, say what you will about those players, but they were guys that they liked and guys that they felt had enough reps and enough experience to be listed ahead of the rookies on the depth chart. So just going through a couple more examples, but you can do this going back years and years, guys. So even the year they traded up to get Devin Bush, that seems like a move of desperation. They traded a lot to go up and get a middle linebacker, but on the roster, they still had Mark Barron and Vince Williams, 2 guys who had started games for them and been, again, in Vince Williams' case, productive player. Mark Barron, not so much, but that was, again, a guy they went out and got and felt comfortable with, and he started next to Bush a good amount. So they had veteran linebackers on the roster. Let's even go back another year, 2018, when they went and got Terrell Edmonds. They had signed Morgan Burnett, a free agent from Green Bay, who was a starter and played for a long time in Green Bay. They brought him in. They signed him just specifically for that year to be their starter. And then they went ahead and drafted Terrell Edmonds anyways. Burnett started, I believe, 2 games that year, got hurt in the second game, and Terrell Edmonds became the starter the rest of the way. And has now been the starter for, the last 4 years and will up, theoretically continue on this year. Um, and then, as I mentioned back in 2017, they go get TJ Watt, but they had Arthur Mote and James Harrison on the roster. And even just kind of looking down the list here, Juju Smith-Schuster, that was when Juju was drafted, and they had Antonio Brown, so they had their starting number one wide receiver. Even Cam Sutton that year, they had Joe Hayden on the roster. And Cam Sutton didn't even really start seeing starter level snaps until this past year after they re-signed him. James Conner they grabbed, but Le'Veon Bell was there, and just on and on the list goes as you look at these guys. It's a really fun game. I definitely suggest everyone kind of go back and play. If you're a Steeler fan, it's fun to just go back and look through the rosters. But I even think, then I kind of look back at their busts, right? So even Artie Burns in 2016, we all remember that. The team had William Gay and Ross Cockrell as their starters that year. So even though we think about how poorly that went with Artie Burns, it wasn't even because he got on the field right away and just played poorly. So it wasn't a fact of we reached because we had to get a corner. Now, did they maybe actually in practice reach because they went and got a corner because they just really wanted one in that draft? Sure, the story goes, they wanted William Jackson, who got drafted a couple picks ahead of them, and so they just took Artie Burns. Be fun to go back through that draft and maybe see what else they could have done or what else they might have been interested in. But it's not like they even threw Artie Burns into the fire. They still had veterans in place there. When they drafted, Bud Dupree ended up working out, but if you look at, Bud Dupree and Jarvis Jones, two outside linebackers that were taken, the team had, whether it was Lamar Woodley or Jason Worlds or James Harrison coming back. So they have veterans on the roster when they make these picks, and that's something that's very, very important to the team. So that was why, it was so surprising when they did not have a strong safety on the roster, even up to now, just 5 days before the NFL draft. But also equally less surprising now that they have re-signed somebody, especially a guy like Edmonds, who's been on the team for years and years, and they know, okay, even if we go with a safety, it's not a person that has to start right away, which I think makes it pretty interesting. You guys can go on phantomsportsofficial.com and take a look at my big board. And in the first round, I have two safeties on there that I think the Steelers could still be in play for at 20, but it's not as big of a need. Lewis Cine from Georgia, I think is really interesting. He's probably less likely, especially now, because he's not quite as versatile as the other safety that I'm thinking, Michigan's Dax Hill. Dax Hill can be kind of like a hybrid defensive back, which the Steelers have clearly shown interested in the last few years. They took Trey Norwood last year, who we saw play some slot corner as well as free safety. Same thing with Cam Sutton. When he was drafted in the third round, he was a safety / cornerback, and he was kind of a backup everywhere. You could see him line up at either safety spot, inside or outside corner. So they like having these hybrid defensive backs, and that's kind of what Dax Hill is. He's a little light. He's not so much that strong tackling or strong hard hitting safety like a Lewis Cine or even to the level of Terrell Edmonds, but he can play in the box because of his instincts. And he's also really good in coverage and can cover tight ends. He can be in the slot. He can be a free safety. I think they could still do something like that, even though they have signed Terrell Edmonds, because like I said before, it's only on a 1-year deal. So they could easily bring in a safety, put him in, specific packages to start him out slow for a year, and then make him the starting strong safety next year when Edmonds is a free agent again. Now, did I like the fact that there was a hole and it maybe seemed like they were going to have to take a safety in the first round? Yeah, a little bit, honestly. I like those two players, Hill and Cine, that I mentioned. So I would have liked to see either of them, and I think they'll have their pick of the litter when it comes to safety, other than Kyle Hamilton from Notre Dame. If you guys go back through this channel's history, we have a couple mock drafts that I did with the person who runs the channel, Ben Parker, as well as a couple other contributors to Phantom Sports. That's Jordan Schultz and Ronan Summers. And defensive backs kind of fell for whatever reason. We took the top corners early. So Derek Stingley's, Ahmad Gardner, Kyle Hamilton, those guys still went in the top 10 to 12. But the other defensive backs are there and available. And for the Steelers, that could be really, really interesting either way, whether they still had holes on the roster as they did when we did those mocks, or even now when we don't have those holes on the roster. So I think that could still be a really interesting fit. And like I said, they'll be available that late in the draft. I especially was interested because I really just don't want to see a quarterback taken at 20 or see the Steelers move up for a quarterback. And you can actually check that on my last video. I talked about the quarterbacks a bit. Um, but it does seem like they might be gearing up to make a trade. Now, there are still a lot of holes on this roster, which I'm sure we'll talk about more as we get closer to the draft. Even though we're already just 5 days away, but this team still needs help at receiver. I'd like to see some linebacker depth, some edge rusher help. Um, Maybe like to see another offensive lineman, but there aren't too many holes on the roster at this point that you would say you need all 7 of those picks. So could they take pick 20, the 3rd round pick, and then a 1st round pick next year and move up and get a quarterback? And then you're talking, you go quarterback, you go wide receiver round 2, and then you get into round 4 and you look for your edge rusher depth. Yeah, that could still happen, and it might still be a pretty good draft. But selfishly, I still would have liked to have seen the safety have to get picked at 20 just so you don't pick the quarterback. And because I know this team isn't taking an offensive lineman, even though that's still what I would like to see. But again, who cares what I want to see, right? I mean, you guys are at least watching, so maybe you care a little bit. So I would still love if Zion Johnson rolled through in the 1st round, but Colbert and Tomlin weren't at his pro day, so we can pretty much rule that out. If you want to look more into what I was just saying, talking about the big boards and what are some realistic options, hop over on fantasysports.com, phantomsportsofficial.com. Sorry, just hopped on my guy, Josh Limesand's corner there. Hop over to phantomsportsofficial.com. You guys can see my big boards. I did a big board series, all 7 rounds, 10 names for each pick. So 20 names in the 7th round with the 2 picks the Steelers have. Really, really fun exercise and hopefully really realistic, not just names that I would like to see, but names that genuinely based on the history of the Steelers draft could get selected. So I'm hoping between those 70 names that I gave, we'll see if all 7 picks end up with the Steelers. So let's see. I think that's everything. So again, just Terrell Edmunds resigns. I think that's a really smart move, really shrewd move, especially considering how much the contract was for. Fills a hole, and now they can do whatever they want in the draft. So we'll see what happens. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. And you can check these videos out. I usually do once a week on here for the Steelers. Usually it comes in around the weekend. So be sure to take a look at that. Be sure to go check out my podcast, the Simon Shortt Podcast on Apple and Spotify. You can follow me on Twitter for all my sports takes at Simon_Shortt with 2 T's. Be safe, everybody. And if I don't talk to you beforehand, enjoy the draft. Thank you.